I'm Jon Schumacher, and I've been in the Pahrump Valley off and on here for about since 1978. I don't do math anymore. And spent a little time in Washington, D.C., about 7 years, and we took an abortive trip up to California for about 2.5, and it was too cold and too snowy, so we came back to Pahrump here in 2000, what was it, 13? But we never lost contact here, so wonderful place. Wonderful museum here, too. I don't know, I think most of you are familiar with it, and if you aren't, take a walk around. I'm a test siter, and I was with the test site contract for about 32 years, and this is a wonderful display here, this Yucca Mountain thing, even though we don't have Yucca Mountain. There's some interesting stuff there. I worked in a little bit of this in different places, but anybody that's worked out there might recognize a portion of the test site that they were involved in. So that was just an aside here. I started this thing out. By the way, this is like church, you know, everybody sits in the back here. Nobody on the front. I don't know. That's what somebody mentioned questions. Yeah, I know there's going to be some things that I'm going to talk about that you'll say, oh, what's that? What does that mean? Well, if you'd I'll try to explain as I go along, but if you hold your questions till the end, that'll be helpful, and then we'll be able to get out of here at a reasonable time. But what I was going to start out with, I started out writing this thing a couple of weeks ago, and I don't want to sit here and read it, but some of it I'm going to have to. This talk is going to be about amateur radio in general and amateur radio in the Pahrump Valley. And to clarify, amateur radio, you've probably heard the term ham radio. Some people use that term. I never liked that term because it denotes ineptitude, I think. And I like to think that maybe we're not as dumb as we act sometimes. We're radio enthusiasts and probably considered a little nerdy at times and that sort of thing. But I just want to clarify that. I'm going to use amateur radio, amateur radio. Yeah, it's difficult to squeeze 57 years of amateur radio experience into a couple of dozen minutes of speaking. Probably going to overlook some things, as I said, and so please hold your questions, as I say. What we're going to do, we're going to cover the origins of wireless communications a little bit, and kind of with an emphasis on amateur radio. And I'll talk about what amateur radio was and what it now is, after a span of about 120 years. And I will also present what I know or have found out about amateur radio in Nye County in the Pahrump Valley. Some interesting stories here. Perhaps some of you in attendance can provide additional detail in this, and there might be some folks here that have been here a lot longer than I have. So, as the older folks know, there wasn't an awful lot going on here back in the 70s or prior to that. I'm a native Californian, by the way. I'm not terribly proud of it, but I spent most of my early years in Wisconsin, and that's where I became interested in amateur radio during the mid-1950s. And I was listening to shortwave broadcasts on an old Philco console radio that my parents had. And on there, while I was tuning around, I'd hear the voices of some of the local amateurs, you know, and some of the guys in town, you'd hear them talking, and it was kind of interesting. So through the Boy Scout program there, I went through Boy Scouts all the way up through Explorers, and I learned the International Morse code with the dots and the dashes. You're probably familiar with that, and maybe as kids you sent SOS or something like that on your desk. I don't know. 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots for SOS. And and during that period, when I was interested and became interested in radio, I found out that we needed to know the International Morse code to get an amateur radio license. So I learned the dots and dashes and practiced and got my merit badge and so forth for signaling and all that kind of business. I was going to bring a flashlight with me, and I didn't, because that's how we learned the code. You know, we'd sit on opposite sides of a room, you know, and we'd flash the Morse code to each other on a flashlight. And you can do that. They use semaphores in the ships at sea. Or not, it's not semaphore. They'd use semaphore, but they also use these big flashing lights. You've probably seen that in the movies. So let's see. One thing I wanted to, let's go ahead. By 1958, I took the entry-level FCC license exam, which was called it was called the novice license. And just a little talk about licensing. It isn't too much different today than it was then. They had an entry-level class called the novice class, and very, very easy Morse code skills. You only needed to know 5 words a minute speed. You had to know the code, but you could pretty much, if you'd practiced a little, you could do 5 words a minute very easy. And they had like a very basic questions. I can't remember if it was 25 or 50 questions. I think it might have been 25 or 30 questions about regulations and a little bit of technical, not much. But being a novice, you weren't expected to know a lot. And of course, being a novice amateur radio operator, you could only operate very limited parts of what then were the amateur radio bands in the frequency spectrum. The other class of license, the next level up, was the general class, and that was what we all strived for, because the novice class was a 1-year non-renewable license. And in order to continue in amateur radio, we had to upgrade in that 1 year, or we lost our privileges and had to start over. And you'd have to start over with a general or something like that. And so there also was another class called the extra class, and it gave you no additional privileges, so nobody really bothered with it. Required a very 20-word a minute code speed and all this kind of business, very much more technical, but nobody needed it. There weren't any additional privileges on the amateur band, so nobody used it. Today it's a little different, but at that time that's the way it was. I'm changing a few things, trying to explain what some of these terms are, because the first time I went through this, I realized my wife helped me out and explained to me that people don't know a lot of this stuff, so I need to explain a little bit. Anyway, the reason, like I say, the novice license, you could only operate code. You know, they had a 2-meter or a very VHF band that you could talk on, and usually the guys that went up there and operated up there ended up not getting an upgrade because they didn't increase their code speed. So those of us on this, we operated code or CW like this. You know, I just sent a V and a F there for some reason. I guess that's because I was reaching around a little funny. Anyway, so that's what code is. I say CW, Morse code, CW, synonymous. CW stands for continuous wave, and that's something from back in the 1920s. You know, it's well, we won't get into that at this moment because we're talking about spark transmitters versus this, you know, vacuum tube and all that kind of business. We'll get to that. So anyway, general class, then we had the extra class, and that was useless. There was another class of license available at the time called the technician class, and that was for people that got toward the end of their novice and they could not upgrade their code speed to the required 13 words per minute for the general class test. So they'd get a technician license, which had the same written test as a general, because generally, if you know, you'd get some expertise during the year and you'd learn about electronics and learn the rules a little better, and you could pass that test. But the code, some people had an awful time with Morse code, and I know some people that just could never get their code speed up enough to pass. So there's some good news on that when I talk about it now. One of the incentives for getting the general class license is you'd be able to operate with voice, using a microphone, you know, to talk to people, which as kids we thought that's wonderful, you know, that's the way to communicate. We didn't want to use that key and the code and everything. It's a lot easier, so we had a little incentive to get the general class license and get on phone in the voice mode. And I can remember some things we used to get on before we got the general class license too, but that's another story. Called bootlegging, I think. I think we covered some of that pretty well. I want to talk about when I got my first license, my call letters were KN9REE. And just to go over the way call letters work, you know, if you remember, if you're older, you remember radio stations, AM radio stations. If you were east of the Mississippi, they started with W. West of the Mississippi, they started with K. Now we got KDAWN, KDWN in Las Vegas. Well, that starts with a K, so I don't know when they got their original license, but that's something, again, from the 1920s and 30s, you know, when they differentiated between the east and the western United States by call letters. To a certain extent, they did that with amateur radio, but nowadays, amateur radio prefixes in the United States start with a K, a W, an A, or an N. Those are the 4 prefixes. They're called radio prefixes that can be used for United States stations and the possessions. KP, K starts for Puerto Rico, KP, and so forth. So a little bit on that, and there's a number there, the 9, designated that I got my license in the 9th call district of the United States. U.S. was divided into 10 FCC, Federal Communications Commission districts, and each district had an engineer in charge. And these are the folks that administered the radio exams back then. And therefore, if you took a test in Wisconsin, Illinois, or Indiana, you were in the 9th district. So I had a K, I had a 9, and then the 3 letters after that were given to me in a serial order. I guess whoever passed his test before me got R-E, what comes before E, D? So he would have been R-E-D, and I was R-E-E, and the guy after me would have been R-E-F. So you notice there was an N in there, KN9, that designated that I was a novice licensee. So the FCC, if they were monitoring the bands, they heard the call letters, they'd know quite a bit about me right there. This is in the days before computers. So that's the thing about call letters. And out here in Nevada, let's see, I think where there's 7 or 8 western states have, they're in the 7th district. Nevada's in the 7th district, so doesn't make sense that my call letters are K1NV now, does it? But I can explain that at some point. I used to be K7NV when I was out in Nevada, so I used to be in the 7th district. But it's a long story, and the call letter thing is not hard and fast anymore. But that'll tell you something about where people come from, and you know, where they got their licenses and that kind of stuff. And it's a little, it's true. You go to England, it'll be a G or an M on the front. You go to France, it'll be an F. If you go to South Africa, it's ZS, Zulu Sierra, and those prefixes designate the country. And then, of course, they have their own setup for districts, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So enough of that. But just want to fill you in on that, because I throw some call letters out here toward the end, and you'll know now what maybe they might mean. We used to take our tests in Wisconsin anyway. We had to go to Chicago or Milwaukee. You had to take the test in front of an FCC examiner. It wasn't any of this mail order stuff, unless you lived a certain amount of distance from any major testing center, which few people did. In Nevada, you probably would have had to travel to LA or San Francisco at that time. Most of the novice operators like me, we used license manuals for study. You know, some of the national radio organizations used to put out manuals, and I have an example over there for the present example. For the general class license, there's a manual where you can study the questions and take the test, and so forth. And there were manuals on how to build your own equipment and everything else, and that was really great for us young guys. I really appreciated a lot of that literature when I was a kid, because it's an awful learning process there to learn electronics and radio and everything else. And a lot of us didn't have a clue what was happening when we got on the air the first time, but over the years we learned. Let's see, and just to complete this, the tests were a demonstration that a prospective licensee had the knowledge of the rules and the regulations and the technical skills to actually operate a radio station. We were administered by the Federal Communications Commission, and they want to make sure that people weren't transmitting out of band or anything like that. Since then, there have been many changes made to the amateur licensing structure. As I mentioned, things have changed a lot, and it's due to the new technologies. You know, since the 1950s, boy, there's tremendous advances in communications. You have cell phones. That represents some very, very drastic changes in technology. With digital communications, there's a lot of things you can do with digital words that you can't do with an analog voice, talking on a microphone. There's a lot of information you can put into that digital word along with the voice information, and that's gives you some encryption possibilities and things like that. So that's the type of thing. And also the FCC cost them a lot less money there to have some volunteers out here give the exams, which is how it works today. Usually today the exams are multiple choice. We used to have to draw diagrams on the exam papers there, but now it's all multiple choice. You got license manuals to help you learn, and plus they have one-day classes and things like that. And just a lot of interesting things. We have a volunteer exam program, and we have a very active group here in Pahrump. They work through the county, through the emergency coordination group in the county too, emergency communications group, and they have tests at least once a month there where you go down there, you take a test in front of them, and they certify that you took the test, and they ship it off to the FCC. In about 2 days you get a license with your call letters. And back when I started out, it was 3 or 4 months before anything happened, between taking the test and call letters. So interesting anyway, how things have changed and they've simplified. It's a lot easier to get a license, and here's the big thing: there's no Morse code requirement anymore. So rejoice. Now that being said, there are a lot of us that still use Morse code. Maybe we're old fogies or something, but there's been a resurgence in interest in Morse code since they dropped it from their license requirement, and there's a couple of groups in the world that promote activities so that we can get on the air and make Morse code contacts and things like that. And I'll talk about the activities as we go along. So basically what we have now, we have a technician license, which is now the entry-level license, no code required. General class license, which is pretty much what it used to be. It lets you operate on all the amateur bands. And then we have the extra class license that has the additional incentive, which isn't much, of a couple little teeny segments in a couple of the traditional amateur bands. So a lot of people don't bother to go any further than the general class license. A lot of things have changed since I started. A lot of commercial radio equipment's available these days. It's expensive, some of it. And we've got antennas available. You pretty much you can buy your whole station. You don't have to build it anymore. Some people like to do that yet. However, some of us still collect and restore vintage radio equipment, comm gear, which is then used on the air. We get on the air with this stuff, and I've got some examples here on the table you might want to look at when we're done. I've got just to point it out, on the far left there, I've got an old two-tube radio that one of the guys in town built. That was Bob Collins, Jerry, that built that two-tube regen receiver, and thing actually works. I didn't bring the power supply for it, but that's an example of 1930s receiver construction. And then a couple other things, some of the newer equipment I've got over here too, and some of the manuals I was talking about, and the license manuals and things like that, if you look after the talk here. So I think I've exhausted that page here, so let me move on. I did want to say that the first amateurs that came were unregulated, and we shared the airwaves with commercial and military interests. There weren't any bands per se, and it's probably a good time to just discuss that briefly. Again, I'm talking about amateur bands. I talk about wavelengths, I talk about frequency. We're not going to do any physics here today, but the amateur bands are designated by their wavelength. We have an 80-meter band. That means that the frequency of the radio waves correspond with a wavelength of 80 meters. In other words, at the speed of light, I'd travel 80 meters. That's about all I can tell you on that, the sine wave. Don't go into that anymore. There's an 80-meter band, there's a 40-meter band, shorter wavelength. There's a 20-meter band, which is even shorter, and et cetera, all the way up to light, which is extremely small for wavelength. So we generally designate the bands by wavelength, but we get on the bands, we start talking about frequency because we can do a better job of resolution there when we tune across a band. And the only thing I can say is if you tuned your FM radio or your AM radio, you're doing the same thing. You're tuning across a bunch of frequencies. And the wavelength is kind of a generality. Don't want to get myself in trouble on that one, so I'm not going to say any more. Development of wireless was very, very slow from the inception of the telegraph. You know, Sam Morse there came up with a practical telegraph in the 1830s. And it wasn't until the early 1900s that we really started to go as far as radio wireless communications. Communicating without wires, you know, was kind of a dream of a few experimenters, but there was really no scientific reason for radio waves to exist. You know, nobody had come up with a theory of electromagnetic theory at that time, and yet there were a few guys that fooled around. I guess they were amateurs or hams, if you want to call them that. In the 1850s, there was a guy called Malin Loomis. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of him. You probably haven't because he disappeared into the dust after the Civil War. But in the 1850s, he was experimenting with kites with metal strings. He's lucky he didn't kill himself. But like Ben Franklin, you know, he flew a kite and had a key down on the end of it and got a discharge across it, and he felt that that was electricity. And I guess Malin Loomis might have read Ben Franklin, I don't know, because he put up a kite with a string on it and put a galvanometer on it, which is basically a meter that would deflect when there was a current flow, and he'd hook ground up at the other end and he'd get a current flow out of the upper atmosphere wherever his kite was. So he thought that was neat. And he put up another one next to it and found that when he touched that wire directly to ground, the meter on the other kite string would go down to zero. And this guy was smart enough to realize that here was a possible means of communications. This is in 1850s. I mean, this boggles my mind when I read about it. And the guy was a dentist, you know, too. I don't know. So eventually he experimented, and he was able to set up two kite strings, you know, 15 miles apart in the mountains in West Virginia. And you'd probably, Jim, you might have heard of him. I don't know. Loomis? No? He's from West Virginia. But he did this, and 15 miles apart, and he was able to get the same result. Of course, he didn't know there were radio waves. He thought the atmosphere was charged, which it is, actually. And he was, you know, everything was in a layer up there. Anyway, he went to Congress. He said, hey, this is a great idea. And he went to Congress there in 1860. Well, what happened in 1860 and 61? You know, the Civil War started. And so the Congress said, well, I'm sorry, but we got to spend it on guns and things like that. So he was repudiated by Congress, and he tried a couple of times. He never could get any money to work on it. So that's what happened. I'm always fascinated by that story. I mean, that absolutely amazing. So there we went. There were a couple of people that fooled around with inductive wireless, but it was not the same thing. And eventually, in the late 1880s, Heinrich Hertz, he was a German. I like Germans. I'm a German. Demonstrated a wireless system in his laboratory, and that proved that electromagnetic waves existed. And it was an interesting apparatus he had. The only reason it worked is because he made both setups exactly the same length. He had a big loop there, and he had a spark gap on one, or he generated a spark on one. He had a little gap on the other one, and as he moved these things further and further apart, he still got, when he sparked the one side, he'd get a spark on the other one. And it probably wouldn't have worked if the two loops hadn't been the same size, because he didn't know anything about electronic resonance. So a lot of people read about it, and they began to experiment and do the same thing. And there was Oliver Lodge and Nikola Tesla. You've probably heard of Tesla. He gets a lot of publicity. But first of all, Oliver Lodge around, it was early 1890s. He was in, I don't know if he's Oxford. He was going to school and experimenting with electricity. And they found out about the Hertz experiments, and he set up the same kind of thing. And he ended up able to transmit a signal about a half a mile on the university campus. with that apparatus. And he had some good ideas, and he's the one that actually discovered the electronic resonance thing, because he probably built two of them different and nothing happened. And so he realized when they're both the same, then you efficiently transmitted a signal. So anyway, he did that, and actually Nikola Tesla built a submarine that I think he had at the World's Fair there, that was remote controlled by wireless. It was a little submarine that he ran around a little pond or something, and he was able to control it wirelessly. So these two guys were on the right track, but they didn't put anything together. They all had other interests, and it was up to Marconi, the Italian, who you've probably heard of, who actually is considered loosely the father of radio. He experimented on his father's estate in Italy there for a couple of years there with what other people had done. There was somebody had developed a detector that could detect electromagnetic energy a little more efficiently than just a spark gap. And he experimented with antennas and things like that, and he gradually was able to communicate over several miles. He realized that this was going to be good for communication. So he took his experiment. Once he had it perfected, he took it to England and tried to sell it to the English military there for ships, and they bought it. They said, hey, this is great. And they were able to talk to their ships as they were coming into port. You know, it wasn't a lot of range on this thing, but you know, a few miles, that's pretty good. And ship can call and say, hey, we're coming in, and they'll have the dock ready and all that kind of business. So this was great. And this was right around the turn of the century. Well, somebody said, you know, what good is this? You know, it's only good for a couple of miles. So Marconi set up a huge transmitting station on the coast of Scotland. I think it was at Androsen, or it was up on the Scottish coast. And Marconi himself took a bunch of apparatus over to Newfoundland and set up on the coast there. And he went in January or February, you know. I can't imagine going there in January or February. And I guess they put up some great big antennas, and they were blown down within a day or two. So he put up a kite-supported wire, because there was, you know, we didn't have the telephone, we didn't have anything, way to communicate. He just had pre-set up the schedule, you know. So they transmitted dutifully there in Scotland. And at the last minute, he got this kite-supported antenna up in the air, and then the detector that he thought was going to work pooped out on him. And he ended up using another detector that somebody provided for him, which actually turned out to be a blessing because it worked. And what he heard this. Because the Scottish station was supposed to send the letter S, which is 3 dots. And they did that over a period of time, you know. And he actually copied it, and in the afternoon, I remember the date, but it was 1901. And copied the 3 dots, at least he says he did. And another couple people in the room heard him. And that was the first transatlantic communication. That really was a revolution there, and everybody realized, you know, maybe this is worthwhile after all. Even though we had undersea cables, you know, still the wireless concept was pretty good. So moving on, we all know that radio began to develop from that point. And as the information, you know, Marconi and other people put out a lot of information about their apparatus. Of course, guys like me and some of the other people here said, hey, this is kind of neat. You know, they saw it in the Electrical Experimenter magazine from 1904 or something and say, hey, I want to build that. So you get a couple of guys together and the guy maybe next door, and you could communicate between the houses and that sort of thing with this little spark gap transmitter. And I might digress slightly. A spark gap is a great transmitter. It generates signals all over the spectrum at once. Much like a light bulb, not these light bulbs, but an incandescent bulb is a lot of white light, which actually is a whole spectrum of light. It's a very noisy thing, actually, from that standpoint. Anyway, so guys started doing this, you know. They found the equipment specs, and they built the stuff, and they experimented, and they did it for the love of it, you know, not for because they were going to make any money off of it. And so they began to be called amateurs. And if you know your Latin, amo, amas, amat, conjugate. That's what my teacher used to tell me. And amateur is based on the Latin amo. So love of it, amateur radio. So radio became known as radio, or I should say wireless became known as radio, and new developments in the technology appeared rapidly after that. there were spark transmitters, high-frequency alternators. They gave way to the vacuum tube, which was developed by Lee DeForest, one of our American folks. Very controversial fellow, but he did have enough brains to stick a grid in between the plate and the cathode of a vacuum diode, and found out that he could control the output there and actually amplify very weak signals by impressing them on the grid of the tube. And this, it doesn't sound like much, but this was a total revolution, because the problem we'd always had with radio receivers is they couldn't hear anything. You know, they were very insensitive. The detectors were very insensitive. They used galena crystal, things like that, and none of that stuff really did a good job of detecting until the vacuum tube came around. Of course, then somebody figured out how to make the vacuum tube oscillate by feeding signal back with feedback, and they had a transmitter that transmitted a pure single frequency signal, which is far better than these big broad spark transmitters that were interfering with each other all the time. So World War I came along and all these developments, and all of a sudden they said, well, you amateurs, we don't need you anymore, you're off the air, you're done while we're at war. So the hams went off the air, and for just a short time, in 1918, the truce. But the government and the Navy in particular didn't want the hams to get on the air again, so they kind of dragged their feet. Well, there was enough push in Congress and elsewhere there to allow the hams to get back on in 1919, and so they did, with some new technology from World War I and with the vacuum tubes. And of course, somebody figured out that you can send music, and people can hear music, and other things, and so broadcast radio came along, and you probably heard of KDKA in Pennsylvania, the oldest station in the nation, and a number of others claim that too, but broadcast radio became a real big thing. Well, there was a little problem there because the hams had the same frequencies as the broadcast stations, so they got shuffled aside again. They had to go to the higher frequencies, the shorter wavelengths, which the technology hadn't really developed equipment for yet. You know, you couldn't get anything to work. You know, higher in frequency you go, the harder it is to get something to work. And I know that from my experience. So they went up these higher frequencies, and some of the more astute hams there built some equipment that worked there, and lo and behold, they found out they could talk around the world on these shorter wavelengths. Nobody knew that. They didn't know about the influence of the ionosphere on signals and how they can bounce the signals off under some circumstances. And so these guys were talking all over the world in the 1920s on the short waves, as they were called, short wavelengths. So it kept mushrooming from there. The equipment got better. Commercial people built equipment. There were some great expeditions to the Arctic and other places there, and they took radio along with them and kept the news services apprised of what they were doing, and a lot of great things in the 30s. I enjoy reading it. Amelia Earhart made her flight to, well, supposedly around the world, but she didn't make it to Howland Island, and nobody knows where she went. Well, there's a group working now, and I contacted them, and I had some information for them, but they found there were some people that heard her signals after she supposedly went down. And it's been pretty well verified that she probably was alive for many months after the plane crashed, but for some reason when they were searching the island that they'd crashed on, they missed them. Well, for whatever reason, one of the planes that flew over, they actually have some pictures they took, and you don't see anything down there. Supposedly uninhabited island. Well, anyway, that's where he was. Well, I was interested in the radio equipment. I'm an amateur, you know. I like radio equipment, and I got in, talked to them, and they sent me the specifications, and they were using some really crummy gear on that Lockheed Electra that she flew. And I was really kind of amazed that somebody like that with a high profile, you know, they didn't have the best equipment. And what some people think happened, they heard her when she was coming toward Howland Island, and, you know, being a radio guy, I was interested in that aspect of it. They could hear her loud and clear, but she couldn't hear them. And they started analyzing some of the movies when she took off from was it LAE, I don't know how you pronounce it, Lae, New Guinea, on her last leg to Howland Island. They saw a big puff of dust under the aircraft, and they had a wire antenna mounted under there, and what they think happened is that wire antenna got torn off the bottom of the plane. So they had a separate receiver for receiving, you know, from the transmitter, and that's what they figured happened, is she couldn't hear anything, you know. So of course they didn't know where to go. They could either go this way or that way, and they went that way, and they ended up a couple of 100 miles south on that deserted island. So amateur radio there was a kind of a stimulus to find out more about what was going on with that. That was Amelia Earhart, and there were some other things, you know, and prior to World War II. And I better get back on topic here. I'm gonna lose my place here. In the 1930s, that's what I said, it saw the Great Depression, but the ranks of radio amateurs continued to grow as young men and women found enjoyment in the hobby. And operators developed their communication skills, obviously, and they found ways to build their own equipment using stuff from the hardware stores and the dime stores. They used to sell radio parts in these stores. And young guys, you know, they'd make a nickel or a dime here, and they'd save up, and very few people could afford a commercial gear at that time. So they learned to build their own stuff, and as we approached a new world war there, these skills would turn out to provide the expertise for communications in the military. When Pearl Harbor, let me see, where was I here? Yeah, immediately following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the hams were shut down again for the duration of World War II. They said, you guys can't be on the air because they're going to home in on your signals, you know, that sort of business. So the major radio manufacturers that existed at the time, they geared up for war production, and a prodigious amount of transmitters, receivers, and associated electronics gear was developed and produced in that 4-year period of World War II. And I have one example of a very common military surplus stuff over here. Those two little black boxes there to the left of that big gray one are what they called command sets. And they had those in all the fighter aircraft and bombers, and then some of the bombers had that stuff, and that stuff was a marvel of engineering. It was actually engineered in 1938-39 and was ready for World War II, very compact by the standards of that day. And that stuff still works. I'll put a power supply on those and they will work. That will transmit 40 or 50 watts and the receiver will receive, and you'll hear signals without doing anything to them. After how many years? 70 years? Absolutely amazing stuff. So all this gear, you know, that they manufactured for World War II, the stuff they didn't dump in the ocean, you know, after the war, came back to the U.S. and ended up on surplus dealers' shelves. And boy, the hams loved that. Right after World War II, the amateur radio was reinstated, you know, new and better than ever. They got some new amateur bands and better regulations, and the license structure stayed about the same until the early 50s. But wonderful stuff, that surplus equipment. And I've got one piece of gear here you might want to look at after the show here, but that gray box sitting there, that's a Japanese field set from World War II. And I understand that's one of 3 that are left in the world. Japanese designed those in the late 30s, and they took them out in the jungles, and the pictures I've seen, they used to carry, they had the whole setup on a back of a mule or something, or a donkey. And that's how they went in the jungles with that stuff. And that one's in pretty good shape. I don't think that ever saw field use, but you know, they disparaged the Japanese technology, you know, in World War II. But I'll tell you something, that is a marvelous piece of equipment. If you look at it closely, I've had the back off and went through it. I have never put the power to it because I'm afraid to, but that's a wonderful piece of gear, very well made. And the Germans, the same. Germans are way ahead in electronics too. They had some great stuff. So that's just something of interest. It's a museum piece, really, and it probably was brought back to the States by intelligence people either during or after the war, and I ended up with a whole bunch of tuning units with it too, which is very unusual to get the accessories with something like that. So you'll notice that there's a Morse code key that folds down and out, and you can sit there and with the transmitter, and it's right in the front panel. It just folds out of a little slot in there, and you can key it. Now I haven't had that on the air, of course, and one guy told me, he says, you better not do that because it's got 400 volts on it. You know, if you touch the key and the case at the same time there, you're going to have a jolting experience. So I'll have to keep that in mind. But the surplus gear is a lot of fun. I got a lot more of it at home, but I can't lift it, so I didn't bring it. Most of that stuff weighs a ton. Okay, so after the war, let me see here. We're going to get into some other things here before we finish up here, but yeah, inexpensive equipment, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, there were some new operating modes. We talked about code and we talked about phone or voice. Well, there were some new operating modes that came out of World War II. One of them was teletype, which is actually a digital form of communications, although they use mechanical devices there to copy it. And we had single sideband, which was an upgrade from the old amplitude modulated transmitters, double sideband amplitude with a carrier, because and they took up a lot less space in the radio spectrum. So you could fit 3 single sideband voice signals into one slot that used to be one slot for a voice signal. So it was a big deal. A lot of neat things came along after the war. It was an emphasis on frequency modulation versus amplitude modulation, that sort of thing. So enough technical crap there, shall we say. Trying to find out where I am here, because I did go a little off. Okay. I did want to get into a little more about what we do in amateur radio today. And you think being a ham, you just get on and talk to people. Well, a lot of people like to do that. That's a fine thing. I enjoy it. I like to get on and talk to somebody and find out where they're at and what they're doing, and you learn some things that way. But there's some other activities too that give a person a little incentive. Some of the radio organizations that we have in the U.S. And other countries have awards that they issue for operating. In our country, we have it's called Worked All States. And what that means is that you made two-way contact with every state in the Union, and you've received confirmation of your contact. And up until a few years ago, that confirmation was called a QSL card. That's what we called them anyway. And it's just a postcard like this with the information on the back, the day, month, year, the time, the frequency that we used, and what mode we were using, either CW or voice or whatever, and then maybe a signal report. And then we'd write some spiffy little thing, thanks for the contact, or something like that. And like I say, we call these QSL cards. And if you get one from each state, each of the 50 states, you could send them in and to the American Radio Relay League in Connecticut, and they would issue a Worked All States certificate, which I have 2 or 3 of over there, with using different modes and things. So that's the kind of activity that spurs people to get on the air, and it might take you a couple of years to get all the states. There's other awards for countries. Amateur radio countries, I might say, are different than physical countries. How can I say that? In amateur radio, we have awards, for getting 100 countries or 200 or whatever. But a country can be any piece of land between, that might be separated from an existing country. I'll use Alaska as an example. Alaska really isn't connected to the United States of America, the continental U.S. Canada is sitting there in between. But for amateur radio purposes, then by definition, Alaska is a separate country. Hawaii is a separate country because it's separated by a couple of thousand miles of ocean from the U.S. So that's another criterion that's used. Some of these countries in the Caribbean, Puerto Rico is a good example. There's a little island between Puerto Rico and another island that we own, and therefore that other island becomes a separate country, even though it's part of Puerto Rico, because there's another country in between. So that type of thing anyway. And of course we have the traditional countries, France and Germany and all that, and all the African countries that change from year to year. So it's a lot of fun to chase countries, and that's one of the major pursuits of a lot of amateurs, is see how many countries they can get over the year in competing, the competition. So that's another one, and there's all kinds of lesser things. I do want to mention Amateur Radio Field Day that takes place the 4th weekend of every June. It's been that way since the mid-1930s, and what that is encourages radio amateurs as clubs or whatever kind of groups they want to put together to go out in the field and operate under emergency conditions on that particular weekend, and it's amazing. We get a tremendous amount of groups that go out and do that in June. And our club here in Pahrump does that. Okay, we're running out of time here. I see they're getting antsy in the back. So, but I did want to mention Field Day because that's something we do. And I'll just skip over a few things and try to give me 10 minutes. I have 10 minutes yet? I don't see anybody falling over yet. Thank you. Okay. I just want to mention that you never know who you're going to talk to on the radio. Prominent hams that I remember, Barry Goldwater, King Hussein of Jordan, Andy Devine, you probably remember him. Some of you do. Chet Atkins, guitar. Arthur Godfrey was a big amateur radio operator. He went all over the world there. Ronnie Millsap. There's some others that we run into. Joe from the Eagles. What was his last name? I forgot. Joe Walsh from the Eagles. Yeah, he's a big amateur there. He's really busy. So, okay. I'm going to skip over some of that. Okay, now we're going to get to what I'm really here for, I guess. And I just wanted to briefly go over some of the history of amateur radio here, because this is a museum. It's a great museum, and that's part of our history. One of the first Nye County amateurs actually was up in Tonopah. He's a guy that came down from Reno in 1906 to Tonopah. He was an amateur. He liked playing with radio stuff, or whatever it was at the time. And he came down to Tonopah in 1906 and set up a radio station there, actually. And what he wanted to do was talk from Tonopah to Manhattan, which was about 30 miles as the crow flies, and probably about 50 if you drive it. So he set up a transmitter at his place, and he set one up in Manhattan in 1910. But Manhattan's got going good, but his didn't work. His didn't transmit. He blew up the power generator in Tonopah there because he was drawing too much power or something. It was a back feed from his transmitter. So it wasn't until 1911 that they made contact. There's no confirmation that they ever did, but we think they did. Guy's name was it was Arthur Raycraft. I noticed they have a Raycraft house outside here that was reconstructed. I don't think that's the same family, though. But Arthur was quite an amateur there, and he was also an entrepreneur. He worked at the bank there, and he brought an avid interest in wireless with him. And eventually he got together with some other guys, and they set up a company there to be in contact with all the big mining camps up north of Tonopah. And by 1919 is when they did that. But by the mid-1920s, the telephones had gotten to all these places, so they had no need for radio anymore, and his company went broke. One thing that kind of tickled me there, in 1928, he started a radio club there in Tonopah, the first Nye County Radio Club. And he had 24 people show up, and like amateurs today, the members complained about the poor operating conditions in Tonopah. That was from the newspaper. So I guess we haven't changed much. And Raycraft died in 1944, by the way, and he's considered a real radio pioneer in Nevada. Now getting down to Pahrump here, I don't think any of us were here in 1949 or 50. Was anybody here that long? No, I was hardly born then. Well, 1949 or 1950, there's a guy named Dale Dorothy. His call letters were W7CTK, and he's from the Henderson area, near as I can tell. That's the earliest I can find on him as far as amateur radio goes, and he was probably licensed prior to that, somewhere in the 7th call area. But I found his mention of him in a column written by his wife, and guess what his wife's name was? Dale's last name was Dorothy. Well, he married a woman named Dorothy. So she was Dorothy. This is no kidding. I got a kick out of that when I saw that, and old-timers know about it, but I always get a kick out of that when I see it. And she was a very prolific writer. She was a singer. She was a songwriter. She knew all the big politicians, Cannon and all these people. She was a big Democrat. And she knew a lot of people here. And she was able to, by the way, she and her husband got the paved road to Pahrump in the 50s. That came before we got power in the 60s. So they did some good things here. But he bought 1,000 acres up on the north end. They called it the 88 Ranch. And there is some significance to that, but I don't want to go into that. That's another story altogether. And he grew alfalfa, near as I can tell. He had irrigation wells, and he had a generator, of course, to run them. And he probably ran his ham station in the house, too. So I found 8 photographs of his amateur stuff. I didn't find them. I know they're there. I've got to get them sent to me from the UNLV library. somebody found all these boxes of stuff that were hidden in a house here in Pahrump that belonged to these people, and donated them to the UNLV library, thank goodness, because believe me, they got a bunch of Johnny pictures in there, photographs that she took. I don't know if any of them have seen the light of day. I've never seen them published. And a bunch of stuff on Pahrump itself, the Pahrump Valley, a whole bunch of information. They got a big box of QSL cards, the information cards I was talking about. So obviously he was a busy guy as a ham. So he was, I think, very interesting. I used to drive by his house out there in the north end, and he had a little ranch-style home in amongst the cottonwoods, and he had a crank-up tower there with a big beam antenna on top of it, you know. And I was thought, gee, I wonder who lives there. And I never made it. So, now come on and sit down. We're just about done here. So, interesting guy. Anyway, he passed away in 1982. I probably mentioned that, and I never had a chance to meet him, unfortunately. So, anyway, when I first moved here to Pahrump, I lived over the hill in what is now Crystal. It was 40 bar estates back then, and bought an acre and a quarter like every other fool. And no water, no nothing there. I did get power, but I had to borrow the water from somebody, and I dug a big hole for the sewer without anything in it except ground. You could do that then. And but there were very few local amateur radio operators at that time. There were about 800 people in this valley here when I moved there, and there was a guy named Glenn Henderson. I don't know if anybody remembers Glenn, but he was a deputy sheriff for the Nye County Sheriff's Department, and I think he later had some involvement with the Nye County brothel wars. But he was a nice guy. I got a kick out of him. He was a character, of course, like most hams, and he liked CW. He liked to operate code, and I made most of my contacts through him on code. I had another guy named Speed Sheets. I don't know if you remember Speed, but he passed away some years ago. But he had a little octagon house out on Quail Run, and he was here before I got here, and he liked to play with antennas and things. But I wondered why he was called Speed, and somebody said that he drove in the Indianapolis 500, or he told somebody he had. And of course everybody laughed and said, no, it's just a bunch of you know what. Well, apparently somebody did some research, and they actually found out that he did. He drove in the 1920s or something like that. He drove a car there at Indianapolis. So interesting. But there were some interesting people here, and there was another guy I was particularly like. He's the guy that built that radio on the far end, that two-tube radio. That was Bob Collins, W6WBY, and he was a veteran of World War II, the Korean conflict, and he did some clandestine work in Europe during the Cold War era. And I just wish I'd had a chance to talk to him a little more, because he was starting to talk about some of this stuff. And very interesting guy, very knowledgeable. Unfortunately, he had Alzheimer's toward the end, and he kind of drifted away and eventually passed away. So his acreage used to look like a huge spider's lair because he liked antennas. You went out there and he had like 2.5 acres, and it was just nothing but wires and poles up in the air. Some of them were falling down. And my wife always said that it looked like a huge spider's web out there, you know, the place, and it did. I did say that. So when he had all that metal up there in the sky, you know, he was very subject to getting hit by lightning, and I ended up inheriting some of his radios, and I'm still working on them because they got zapped by lightning, and that's one of the worst things that can happen to a piece of electronics gear. I shouldn't quit without mentioning Bill Dawson here, W7TVS. He passed away just a year or two ago, and he was actually from Vegas, but he came out here, and he had about, what do you have, 5 acres, Jerry? Yeah, and that was all antennas too, and he had one antenna system that would rival a lot of the AM broadcast stations that you see with the big towers and everything, and he used to talk all over the place. We couldn't believe the stuff that he talked to with his antennas. Okay, here's Art Bell. You all know who Art Bell is, or was, or is. I assume. I don't think Art's here, is he? I don't see him. Do you see him? I hope not. I don't know Art Bell personally. I've talked to him a number of times on the radio, but some people here know him a little better than I do. But I'll tell you something. He deserves a lot of credit for putting Pahrump on the international map. with his radio show. He got all over the world with that, I believe, and I don't know where he is today, but his Pahrump home is still on the south side, and if you ever drive down there toward the brothels, look on the right there, and you'll see his antenna farm. He's got some very impressive antennas up in the air there. And whenever I say that I'm in Pahrump, on the airwaves, the guy always comes back and asks me if I know Art Bell. And I say, well, he lives 2 miles south of me, and blah, 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 and I don't know if he's here or not. So I don't know of any other PR effort in this town that was more effective than Art Bell and his efforts. Okay, that's about it. I mentioned some of the equipment, and if you'd like to look at it, I'll stand here and show it to you. One of the reasons we're here today is we've got an amateur radio display we're starting here in the museum based on the amateur radio activity that we've had in the valley. A very important part of this. We have over 300 hams here in the valley that are licensed. I don't know why all of them aren't on the air, but there's at least 300 here in this valley that have amateur radio licenses. A lot of things I haven't talked about. The museum, of course, is going to have the station here, and it's up and working. I just talked to Barbados here just before we came in for the meeting, and if you'd like to see that, it's out on the left out there toward one of the exit doors. And that's going to become a better display as we go along, and we'll get donations, and some of us will donate some stuff for it so we can showcase amateur radio. Anyway, we welcome suggestions on how to improve the displays, and if you have any ideas there, let me know on the radio part of it. And I'll tell you folks, thanks for attending today. I didn't cover everything I wanted to, but believe me, I've been here a heck of a lot longer than I thought I was going to be. I thought it was going to be about 35 minutes, and I'm rambling and you're going to sleep. So thank you very, very much for being here.